Robert Hale came home unannounced. No phone call. No warning. No one knew he was back. For a year, the mansion had been wrapped in silence. The kind of silence that grief builds brick by brick, room by room, until even breathing feels too loud. But the moment Robert stepped through the front door, something was different. He heard noise. Not just noise. Crying. 3 voices overlapping, desperate, chaotic. His heart slammed against his ribs. He froze in the marble entryway, his briefcase still in his hand, his body refusing to move forward. What is that? The sound grew louder. He moved toward it, his pulse hammering in his ears, his hands beginning to tremble. Past the portraits he hadn't looked at in months. Past the sitting room that still smelled like Clarissa's perfume. Toward the nursery he'd been avoiding like a wound that wouldn't close. The cries were coming from behind that door. He reached it. Light spilled through the cracks at the edges. His palm pressed flat against the wood, and for a moment he couldn't push. What if I can't handle what's inside? But he did. He pushed the door open. And what he saw inside stopped his entire world. Robert Hale was a billionaire. Self-made. Built his empire from nothing. Turned distressed properties into luxury developments worth hundreds of millions. Tech investments, commercial real estate, venture capital. Everything he touched turned into gold. But all the money in the world couldn't bring back what he'd lost. His wife, Clarissa, died during childbirth. Complications. Hemorrhaging. The doctors said they did everything they could. She was gone before Robert even made it to the hospital. At her funeral, something broke inside him. And it broke inside his newborn triplets, too. Though they were too small to understand why the world suddenly felt colder. 3 babies. 3 tiny lives that reminded him of both love and unbearable loss. Mary, Edith, and Michelle. Born the same night their mother died. For weeks, Robert couldn't look at them without feeling like his chest was caving in. He tried. God, he tried. He hired the best nannies, the most expensive pediatricians, sleep consultants, developmental specialists. He bought every gadget, every monitor, every piece of equipment that promised to keep them safe and thriving. But he couldn't stay in the same room with them for more than a few minutes. Every cry felt like an accusation. Every time he held one of them, he felt Clarissa slipping further away. So Robert did what broken men do when they don't know how to grieve. He ran. Business summits in Singapore. Real estate acquisitions in Dubai. Board meetings in London. 16-hour workdays that bled into 18, then 20. He convinced himself he was building their future, securing their legacy. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He was suffocating in that house, and work was the only place he could breathe. His estate had 12 bedrooms, an infinity pool, a private gym, a home theater, acres of manicured gardens. But it was the loneliest place on earth. One afternoon Martha, the head housekeeper who'd been with the family for 15 years, knocked on his office door. "Mr. Hale," she said carefully, "I need to speak with you about the babies." Robert didn't look up from his laptop. "Are they okay? Is something wrong?" "They're fine physically, sir. But the household staff were stretched thin. The night nurse quit last week. Mrs. Pemberton is managing, but 3 infants require more attention than we can give. I'd like to hire additional help." "Fine. Hire whoever you need, Martha. Just handle it." She hesitated. "Sir, perhaps you should be involved in." "Martha." His voice was sharper than he intended. "I trust your judgment. Do what's necessary." 3 days later, Deborah Hart walked through the front door. 28 years old. Quiet. Hardworking. She'd been raising her younger sister's children after her sister passed away 2 years earlier. She understood loss. She knew what it looked like when grief tried to convince you that love wasn't worth the risk. Robert saw Deborah exactly once during her first week. She was carrying a laundry basket down the hallway, her uniform crisp, her expression focused. She nodded politely. "Good morning, Mr. Hale." He barely glanced at her before disappearing into his office. But his triplets noticed her. Deborah didn't try to replace their mother. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep or use baby talk that felt patronizing. She just showed up. Every single day. Folding their tiny clothes with care. Humming old hymns while she worked. Being present without demanding anything in return. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the babies started responding. In the first week, Mary would stop fussing when Deborah entered the nursery. In the second week, Edith would track Deborah's movements with her eyes, following her across the room. In the third week, Michelle reached for Deborah during a particularly difficult night, tiny fingers grasping at air, until Deborah picked her up. "It's okay, sweet girl," Deborah whispered, rocking her gently. "I've got you." Michelle settled instantly. Week after week, something sacred was happening in that nursery. Something Robert never saw because he was never home. The triplets started cooing when Deborah sang to them. They'd calm at the sound of her voice. By 6 weeks, they were lighting up when she walked into the room. Genuine baby smiles that melted even Martha's usually stern expression. Deborah didn't announce these milestones. Didn't send reports or demand recognition. She just loved them. Quietly. Patiently. The way you water a garden and trust that growth will come in its own time. Robert had no idea his children were thriving. He was in Tokyo closing a massive deal when he should have been home. Exhausted, jet-lagged, running on 3 hours of sleep and too much coffee. He wasn't supposed to return for another 4 days. But something inside him, maybe guilt, maybe intuition, said go home. He didn't call ahead. He just booked the next flight and left. When he walked through the front door late that evening, the house felt the same as always. Silent. Still. Empty. He dropped his luggage in the foyer, loosened his tie, and stood there for a moment, letting the familiar weight of the place settle over him. Nothing changes. Nothing ever changes. But then he heard something. Crying. His body went rigid. He stood frozen in the entryway, his breath catching in his throat. It can't be. The house had been quiet for so long, professionally managed, perfectly controlled. The babies were always asleep when he came home. He'd arranged it that way. But these sounds were real. Not one baby. 3. A chaotic symphony of infant cries that made his pulse spike and his hands start to shake. He didn't understand. What's wrong? Why isn't anyone helping them? He moved toward the sound, faster now, his heart pounding. Down the hallway. Past the sitting room. The cries grew louder, more desperate. The nursery. He reached the door. Light spilled from beneath it, warm and golden. His hand trembled as he gripped the handle. And when he pushed that door open, what he saw inside shattered every assumption he'd built about his life, his children, and the woman he'd barely noticed. But before we continue, I need you to understand something. What Robert witnessed in that room would force him to confront a truth he'd been running from for an entire year. A truth about love, about presence, about what it really means to be a father. So stay with me because this moment, this single, devastating moment, changes everything. Now let me tell you what Robert saw in that nursery. The room was awash in soft lamplight, shadows dancing gently on the pale yellow walls. Deborah sat in the rocking chair near the cribs, her uniform slightly rumpled, her hair falling loose from its usual neat bun. She was holding all 3 babies at once. Michelle in her lap, Mary against her shoulder, Edith reaching desperately for her neck. All 3 of them crying, their tiny faces red and streaked with tears, their bodies trembling with the kind of distress that breaks a parent's heart. Deborah looked overwhelmed, exhausted. But still she rocked them, whispered soft comfort, tried to soothe all 3 at once even though it was clearly impossible. Shushu, I know, sweethearts. I know. It's okay. You're okay. And then she saw Robert standing in the doorway. Her eyes went wide. Mr. Hale. I didn't know you were. She tried to stand, tried to carefully transfer the babies back to their cribs. But the moment she started to move, the crying intensified. Michelle's tiny hands clutched at Deborah's uniform. Mary arched her back, reaching for her. Edith let out a wail so desperate it sounded like terror. They were reaching for her. Not for him. Robert stood there, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his tie still knotted, his briefcase probably still lying in the foyer where he'd dropped it. And his children, were crying harder because the maid tried to put them down. They didn't even look at him. It was like he didn't exist. For 3 seconds, Robert felt something crack open inside his chest. They don't know me. I'm their father, and they don't know me. Then something uglier rose up behind the grief. Jealousy. Shame. Rage. This woman, this quiet, unassuming maid he'd barely acknowledged, had done what he couldn't. She'd become their world. While he was building his empire and running from his pain, she was here, being their mother. And he hated her for it. Robert stepped fully into the nursery. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing, what his heart was feeling. Mr. Hale, Deborah's voice was shaking. I'm so sorry, I didn't hear you come in. They've been fussy all evening, I was just trying to. She stood carefully, trying to balance all 3 babies, her movements gentle but clearly panicked. Let me just put them down, sir. She moved toward the nearest crib, trying to lay Michelle down first. The baby's scream split the air like a siren. Michelle's tiny arms shot out, fingers grasping desperately for Deborah's uniform, her face crumpling in distress. Mary and Edith immediately joined in, their cries escalating into something primal, terrified. All 3 of them reaching, stretching, clinging to her like she was the only safe place left in the world. Deborah froze, her eyes filling with tears. I'm so sorry. Robert's jaw tightened. Not at her. At the truth staring him in the face. They don't know me. The thought hit him like a physical blow. He flashed back suddenly, violently, to the hospital. The fluorescent lights. The doctor's grim expression. Mr. Hale, we did everything we could, but your wife, she didn't make it. Clarissa's hand, still warm when he held it, but already gone. The nurse bringing the babies in, 3 tiny bundles wrapped in hospital blankets. Would you like to hold them? He couldn't. He'd just shaken his head and walked out. That became the pattern. Singapore, London, Dubai, Tokyo, Geneva. Every trip an excuse. Every hotel room a hiding place. Every time Martha called asking when he'd be home, he'd find another meeting, another deal, another reason to stay away. He'd stand outside the nursery door sometimes when he was home, his hand on the handle, but he could never push it open. The grief was too thick. The guilt too suffocating. And now here he was. A stranger in his own children's lives. Why? His voice came out rough, broken. Why are they like this with you? Deborah clutched the babies tighter, her face pale. Sir, I spend time with them. I feed them, change them. I'm here when they wake up at night. I didn't mean to. To what? Robert's voice rose despite himself. To become their mother? Deborah flinched like he'd struck her. Mr. Hale, I would never. How long has this been happening? Sir. How long have they been attached to you? Deborah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. A few weeks, maybe. They just started responding more when I wasn't here. Robert finished the sentence, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. While I was working. While I was building their future, you were. What? Replacing me? No, sir. Never. I was just what, Deborah? His tone turned sharp, defensive. Just taking advantage of my absence? Just overstepping boundaries while I was gone. The words hung in the air, ugly and unfair. Deborah's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. And in the silence that followed, Robert realized with sickening clarity what he'd just done. He'd blamed her for his own failure. This is completely inappropriate. Robert's voice cracked like a whip across the nursery. The babies were still crying, still reaching for Deborah, and every second of it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. You've made them dependent on you. You've confused boundaries. You're the help, Deborah, not there. He couldn't finish the sentence. Deborah's face went white. Mr. Hale, I never meant to overstep. I was only what? Only playing mother while I was gone. No, sir. I cared for them because... Her voice trembled. Because no one else was. The words landed like a slap. Robert's face flushed red. How dare you? I am sorry. Deborah's hands were shaking now. I didn't mean it like that. I'll put them down. I'll leave. She moved to the cribs again, her movements careful despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. She laid Michelle down first. The baby's scream was immediate, desperate, her little fists pounding the mattress. Then Mary. Then Edith. All three of them wailing, faces red. Arms reaching up toward Deborah like she was abandoning them. Robert couldn't stand it. Let me. He reached into the crib, his hands awkward and uncertain as he tried to pick up Michelle. The baby arched away from him, her cries escalating into something that sounded like terror. She turned her face away, straining toward where Deborah stood. She's afraid of me. Robert pulled his hands back like he'd been burned. His chest felt tight. His throat closed up. His vision blurred at the edges. Deborah stood frozen by the door, her hand covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Get out. His voice was barely audible over the baby's cries. Sir, just get out. Deborah hesitated for only a second before fleeing the room, and Robert stood there alone, surrounded by the sound of his children crying for someone else. The words escaped before he could stop them, echoing into the empty hallway after her. Maybe you've taken advantage of my absence. The moment they left his mouth, he knew. He'd just destroyed the only person his children loved. Deborah stumbled into the hallway, her hand pressed against her mouth, trying to muffle the sobs that were tearing out of her. Behind her, the baby's cries echoed through the mansion, piercing, relentless, heartbreaking. Robert stood in the center of the nursery, paralyzed, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Then he heard footsteps. Heavy, measured, deliberate. Mr. Langford appeared in the doorway. The head butler was 72 years old, dignified, unshakable. He'd served the Hale family for 23 years, and had never once raised his voice or overstepped his position. Until now. Mr. Hale. His voice was calm. Too calm. We need to speak. Not now, Langford. I can't. Yes. Now. Robert looked up, startled by the steel in the old man's tone. Langford stepped fully into the nursery, closing the door behind him despite the baby's continued crying. That woman you just accused, Langford said quietly, has been living in this nursery for the past 2 months. Robert blinked. What? She sleeps in the chair most nights. She sings them to sleep. She knows which cry means hunger, which means pain, which means they just need to be held. Langford, I don't. There were 3 nights when Michelle couldn't breathe properly. Deborah sat up with her until dawn, monitoring every breath. She called the pediatrician herself, because no one else was here to do it. Robert's face went pale. The doctors warned us 6 weeks ago that the babies were showing signs of attachment disorder. Do you know what that means, sir? It means they were shutting down, failing to bond, failing to thrive. Oh God, Deborah saved them. Langford's voice cracked just slightly. She learned their patterns. She gave them stability. She made them feel safe. The room felt like it was closing in. Those children are alive and attached because of her, Langford said, his words landing like hammer blows. You didn't lose them tonight, sir. He paused, letting the silence stretch. You never claimed them. Robert's legs gave out. He sank onto the edge of the rocking chair, his head falling into his hands. And for the first time since Clarissa died, he let himself feel the full weight of what he'd become. Not a father. A ghost. Robert couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, Langford's words circling his mind like vultures. You never claimed them. At 2 a.m, he gave up. He pulled on a robe and walked through the dark mansion, his bare feet silent on the marble floors. He didn't know where he was going until he found himself standing outside the nursery door. It was cracked open slightly. Soft light spilled through the gap. And then he heard it. Singing. Robert froze. Deborah's voice was quiet, gentle, barely more than a whisper, but it carried through the silence like something sacred. Hush, little ones, close your eyes. Mommy's watching from the skies. She loves you more than words can say. She'll keep you safe both night and day. Robert's throat tightened. He edged closer to the door, peering through the crack. Deborah sat in the rocking chair, cradling all 3 babies against her chest. They were finally calm, their tiny bodies relaxed, their breathing steady and soft. Daddy's learning, give him time. His heart is healing, just like mine. He will love you, he will stay. Daddy will come back someday. Robert's knees nearly buckled. Tears burned hot trails down his face. Tears he couldn't stop, couldn't swallow, couldn't hide. She's been singing about me. She's been telling them I'll come back. Even after what I said to her. Deborah pressed a soft kiss to each baby's head, her own tears falling silently onto their blankets. Your mama loved you so much, she whispered. And your daddy, he loves you too. He's just forgotten how to show it. But he'll remember. I promise you, sweethearts. He'll remember. Michelle sighed in her sleep. Mary's tiny hand curled around Deborah's finger. Edith nuzzled closer into the warmth of her chest. Robert stood in that doorway, watching this woman, this underpaid, overworked, beautiful-hearted woman, pour love into his children while singing prayers about him that he didn't deserve. And something inside him cracked wide open. Not just guilt. Not just shame. Something deeper. The realization that he'd been so busy protecting himself from pain that he'd abandoned the 3 people who needed him most. And the only reason they'd survived was because of her. Robert backed away from the door slowly, his hand covering his mouth, his whole body shaking. What have I done? What kind of father am I? Deborah's hands shook as she folded the letter. The paper was simple, her handwriting careful despite the tears that kept blurring her vision. Dear Mr. Hale, I'm resigning effective immediately. I apologize for overstepping my role. I hope you find someone better suited to care for your children. Deborah Hart. She packed her few belongings into a worn duffel bag. 2 uniforms, some toiletries, a photo of her sister, the crayon drawing Mary had made weeks ago that she couldn't bear to leave behind. I ruined everything. I made them too attached. I confused them. What if I damaged them? She wiped her eyes and zipped the bag closed. Mr. Langford found her in the staff quarters, already dressed in street clothes. Miss Hart. Please don't try to stop me, Mr. Langford. It's better this way. He needs to know you're leaving. He'll be relieved. 10 minutes later, Langford knocked on Robert's office door. Sir, Miss Hart is leaving. Robert looked up from his desk, confused. What? She's resigned. She's walking out right now. The words hit him like a freight train. No. 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 Robert bolted from his chair, racing through the hallway, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He burst through the front door just as Deborah reached the end of the driveway. Rain was falling, soft at first, then harder, soaking through his shirt. Deborah. Wait. She stopped but didn't turn around. He ran to her, breathless, desperate. She held out the letter with trembling hands. Mr. Hale, I don't. His voice cracked. Please don't do this. They need stability, sir. Her voice shook, rain mixing with tears on her face. They need someone you trust. Someone you won't resent. I don't resent you. You accused me of. I was wrong. Robert's voice broke completely. I was scared and jealous and so ashamed of myself that I blamed you for my failures. Deborah's lip trembled. Don't go, Robert whispered, rain streaming down his face. My children need you. He paused, his next words barely audible. And I need your help to be their father. The letter slipped from her fingers, landing in a puddle at their feet. Deborah agreed to stay for 2 weeks. Just until you find someone permanent, she said quietly. Robert nodded, knowing he'd never find anyone else. Knowing he didn't want to. The lessons began that afternoon. Support the head, Deborah instructed gently, guiding Robert's hand beneath Michelle's tiny skull. There. Just like that. Robert's hands trembled. The baby felt impossibly fragile, like she might break if he breathed wrong. Michelle squirmed and began to fuss. I'm doing something wrong. You're tense. She can feel it. Deborah placed her hand over his. Breathe. Relax your shoulders. He did. Michelle settled slightly, her eyes focusing on his face with curious uncertainty. Roberto Isparat. It's your daddy. The word felt foreign in his mouth, but he said it anyway. Feeding was harder. Mary refused the bottle when Robert tried, turning her face away, her cry escalating. Try warming it a little more, Deborah suggested. She's particular about temperature. He tried again, and again. On the fourth attempt, Mary finally latched on, her tiny hand resting against his. Robert's eyes filled with tears. She's eating. She's trusting you, Deborah said softly. He learned their cries. Michelle's was sharp and immediate. Mary's built gradually. Edith's came with hiccuping gasps. He learned that Edith liked being bounced gently, that Mary needed constant eye contact, that Michelle would only calm if you hummed low and steady. The failures were frequent and humbling. Diapers put on backwards. Bottles made too hot. Michelle spitting up all over his expensive shirt. But Robert kept trying. Each morning he showed up. Each night he stayed. Deborah watched him transform. The hard edges softening. The walls crumbling. Grief making space for something that looked almost like joy. Their dynamic shifted without either of them naming it. He stopped giving orders. Started asking questions. She stopped flinching. Started smiling. You're doing well, she said one evening, watching him rock Edith to sleep. I have a good teacher. Their eyes met across the nursery, and something unspoken passed between them. Not romance. Not yet. But recognition. Two broken people learning to build something whole. And slowly, beautifully, the babies began reaching for both of them. The mansion began to feel different. Not just quieter. Alive. Robert canceled the Singapore trip. Then London. Then Dubai. His board of directors panicked until he announced he was hiring a COO. Someone he trusted to handle day-to-day operations while he focused on what actually mattered. Family leave, he called it, though none of them dared question the billionaire's decision. His mornings now began in the nursery instead of his office. Coffee in one hand, Michelle cradled in the other, watching the sunrise through the windows while she cooed softly against his chest. His evenings ended with storybooks, reading to babies who couldn't yet understand the words but seemed to love the sound of his voice anyway. Deborah was there through all of it. Not hovering. Not correcting. Just present. A steadying force that made him believe he could actually do this. Mr. Langford noticed first. The house feels warmer, he mentioned to Martha one morning. It's him, Martha replied, watching through the doorway as Robert laughed, actually laughed, while Edith grabbed his nose. He's finally home. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening. Robert was rocking Mary after her bottle, humming the lullaby Deborah had taught him, when he felt her body go completely slack. He looked down. She was asleep. Fully, peacefully asleep in his arms. Her tiny face pressed against his chest, her breathing deep and steady, her fingers still curled around his thumb. Robert's breath caught. Deborah, he whispered. She's. Deborah turned from the changing table, where she was dressing Michelle. When she saw them, her face transformed. A real smile. Not polite or careful, but genuine, radiant, proud. You did that, she said softly. All you. Robert couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Thank you, he finally managed, his voice barely audible. For not giving up on us. Deborah's eyes shimmered. You never needed me to save them, Mr. Hale. You just needed someone to remind you how. Their gazes held across the nursery. Something deeper stirring in the space between words. Not employer and employee. Not anymore. Something neither of them was quite ready to name. But it was there. Growing slowly, carefully. Like trust. Like hope. Like family learning to breathe again. It happened on a Sunday morning. Robert walked into the nursery carrying nothing but himself. No bottle, no diaper, no agenda. just a father checking on his children. The triplets were in their play area, surrounded by soft toys and blankets, babbling to each other in that secret language only they understood. Then they saw him. All three pairs of eyes turned toward the doorway at once. And then it happened. Michelle lifted her arms. Mary crawled toward him, faster than he'd ever seen her move. Edith made that excited squealing sound she'd started making when something made her happy. They were reaching for him. Not crying. Not afraid. Reaching. Robert's knees buckled. He dropped to the floor, and they came to him. All three of them, climbing into his lap, their tiny hands patting his face, their giggles filling the room like music. "Hi, babies," he choked out, gathering them close. "Hi, my beautiful girls. Daddy's here. Daddy's finally here." The tears came hard and fast, but he didn't try to stop them. He just held his children and let himself feel everything he'd been running from for a year. The grief, the love, the crushing weight of almost losing them, and the impossible grace of getting a second chance. From the doorway, Deborah watched with her hand pressed to her heart. Robert looked up, his face wet with tears, and saw her standing there. "Deborah." She stepped inside, her own eyes glistening. "You didn't replace me," Robert said, his voice breaking. "You helped me become who I was supposed to be." Deborah's breath hitched. "You did the work, Mr. Hale. You showed up." "Robert," he corrected gently. "Please. Just Robert." She smiled through her tears. "Robert." He shifted, making space beside him on the floor. "Will you sit with us?" Deborah hesitated only a moment before settling down beside him. The babies immediately reached for her too, dividing their affection equally, completely, between the two people who loved them most. Robert looked around the nursery, at his daughters, healthy and happy and whole, at Deborah, whose quiet strength had saved them all, at the light streaming through the windows, warm and golden and alive. This was what family looked like. Not perfect, not polished, but present, rebuilt from grief and held together by love that refused to give up. A father who'd finally come home, a woman who'd taught him how, and three tiny miracles who'd been waiting for him all along. The house was no longer silent. It was finally, beautifully alive.